All right, we are on, we are back, and this week we are in the last half of 1 Samuel 14. We stopped in verse 23, we're going to start in verse 24, and of course it ends in verse 52, this chapter. There's a lot of kind of interesting stuff here. Now, let's read first. So let's go to
What chapter?
1 Samuel 14.
14.
All right, let's read 24 through 29 and let's unpack these. Now, the men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul had put the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. And all the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. When the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey, but no man would put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under the oath. Do you understand why? Remember? Because he wasn't there. He was in this raid that he created with his armor bearer that started this whole process of the battle. So he was separated from them. He didn't know about this oath, okay? So, verse 27, but Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under the oath. Therefore, he put out the end of his staff that wasn't in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Keep that in mind as I go on. His eyes brightened, okay? It says, then one of the people answered and said, your father strictly put the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food today." Now, and I'm going to have another one I want you to remember. And the people were weary. Remember that, okay? You're going to hear it again in a minute. Mm-hmm. So it says, then Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened, because I tasted a little of the honey. Okay, so let's go through these. Now, remember at the end of last week, we talked about how the Lord led Jonathan in faith to go up this cleft, this craggy cleft, to this flat place, a narrow place, where there was a garrison of Philistines. He went up, it was exactly the right shape. No one could get behind him, okay? And he slaughtered these 20 that were in that little area, which started a panic, which then the bigger camp heard, and they started to panic. Okay, so that's what happened. So remember, it only after that Saul decided to send his 600 down into the Philistine camp and start war. That's how it worked, okay? Now, remember, ancient battles were almost always multi-day events. You can't really do much battle at nighttime in the ancient world, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's no light. You might kill some of your own people because you can't see well, all right?
I don't think you can fight it even today's.
Well, we do.
Darkness.
Today we have night vision goggles
True.
and night vision equipment, so actually we can see, but that's very modern.
Yeah.
So before, you know, they were limited to daytime battle. Now, normally what would happen is it got towards the end of the day, people were extraordinarily weary. Try using a sword all day long and pushing people and wrestling with people and all this stuff. I mean, it's like playing multiple football games in a row.
Mm-hmm.
So they end up at the end of the day absolutely famished. Okay. Now, remember that they really, at the end of the day, needed to recover by eating, but the oath kept them from eating anything for that 24 hours. The oath ended at the end of the 24 hours, but during that time, Saul's oath said, you can't eat anything. Now, on top of that, Saul makes another impulsive and foolish decision, like I said, by insisting on this 24-hour oath. Now, it's interesting what the Old Testament says about oaths. I want to show you a couple passages, but really in the Old Testament, you're going to see it really discourages making an oath. Okay, it is something that God warns, don't ever do this lightly, because if you make it, you got to keep it. All right. Now look at a couple verses here. Look at Deuteronomy 23. I'll show you a couple of verses in the Torah, and I'll show you in the New Testament. Deuteronomy 23. And we're going to look at, when I get there, we're going to look at verses 21 through 23. Okay? Starting at 21. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be a sin to you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You see the balance? If you make an oath, you got to keep it, but you don't got to make one. Okay? All right, that's your choice. Verse 23, you shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised. In other words, be careful what you claim. Now, go back to Numbers 30 from Deuteronomy. Okay. And we're going to look at verse 2. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. All right? Now, there's another thing you need to see here. It's clear that oaths in the Torah are voluntary. Was this oath about not eating voluntary? No. Saul insisted that they make it. He forced it. That's wrong. You can't force an oath on someone. It has to be voluntary. So there's another violation he does there. And then let's look also at Matthew. Go back to the New Testament to Matthew 5. Here's the most famous warning about all this from Jesus. Matthew 5. Start at verse 33. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. Jesus says, there's verse 34, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Therefore, let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And then he adds this important verse, and anything beyond this is evil. So what Saul is doing is both evil in that he's doing it, and it's evil that he's forcing on these people that don't voluntarily want to do it. See? All right. And you can also see, since you're in Matthew, go back to the book of James, just after Hebrews. Go to chapter 5. Here's the warning of James, the brother of the Lord, in 5 verse 12. He says, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under judgment. What you're going to see as we go on is that Saul, by making a whole series of dumb decisions, digs himself into a very deep hole with the Lord. Okay? Over and over again. Think how many times we've pointed out the things he's done that he never should have done, over and over and over again. This just adds to the pile, okay?
This oath thing, that isn't even today when people get married and say, I pledge my life to this person, and then they don't.
I know. And again, that's an oath that's fine to take. Keep it, right? The oath is until one of them dies.
That's right.
That's the length of the oath, you know, so you're right. Okay, now, verse 24 of chapter 14, let's go back there. Notice it tells us what Saul's motive was for the oath, okay? Look at it. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening and until I have avenged myself on my enemies. I, my, me.
It's all about him.
It's all about him, okay? Now notice he's taking credit also for something that he didn't start. The plan wasn't his, and he's now in the mop-up effort after his son faithfully starts this battle. But what does he claim? It's all about him, okay? Now, the army, of course, was forced to take this vow. They then start back, the 600 men of Saul's men, they start back to the site where the Philistine army is. They're marching there, and of course, they go into a forest area, and what do they see in the forest laying around?
Honey.
Honey, okay? They see honeycombs, but the men that took the oath, or forced to take the oath, don't eat, okay? They will not eat it. Now, one of the things that is interesting, I told you that typically battles were multi-day events in the ancient world, all right? Think what it's like if you're forced to be in a battle all day long from dawn till night. Can you imagine what your blood sugar level is?
0.
Okay, therefore you're not going to have much energy.
No.
Okay,
And you'd be very angry that this is being told to do this.
you would think that's true. Okay, so they have tremendous fatigue. Okay, and of course, look what happens in verse 29. Okay, Jonathan responds by having eaten honey. My eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. He got sugar. His blood sugar undoubtedly went up. He had more stamina as a result. So he now is capable because he's taken in nourishment as a result of all these battles. Now, as we said, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not present when this oath occurred in the camp of Saul. They were fighting in a different area. So Jonathan, obviously, and his armor bearer reconnect to the army. You see, Jonathan had not heard of this. He obviously comes to this force. Verse 28, one of the people there, one of the military people said, your father strictly put the people under the oath. So he's now gone back into the fighting force of Saul's. Okay. And one of them notices that he's taken honey, and he says, your father put us under an oath, right? In other words, why are you doing this? Your father put us under oath. Look at Jonathan's response. Verse 29. Then Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. What's he mean?
Caused all kinds of grief. Did it all wrong.
He could have said it one way to be a little easier, but my father's stupid. Okay? That's what he means.
Right.
All right.
Really?
In other words, he looks at the whole scenario and thinks, what's this guy doing? You know, he didn't start the battle. He wasn't led to start the battle. I was led to start the battle. I started the process. Okay. And then he starts hamstringing his own army. That's what he's doing. Because he's arrogant. That's why. All right, now, let's read verses 30 through 39. How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found, for now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. See what he says in verse 30? We could have done so much more, but you guys didn't have the energy to do it. All right, 31. And they struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very, this is the second time it says it, weary. Second time. And the people rushed greedily upon the spoil, that is the spoil of the Philistines, their cattle, okay. They rushed greedily upon the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Next sin.
Yes.
Okay?
Not good.
All right. We'll talk about it in a second. Then they told Saul, saying, behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. And he said, no.
Yeah,
Only the blind can make statements like this.
really.
He said, you have acted treacherously. Roll a great stone toward me today. In other words, what he's saying is we need to set up an altar. Okay? Roll this great stone over so that they can slaughter the animals on the stone and properly drain the blood out of them. Because that's what they do on the altar.
Right.
Okay, they drain it, all right?
Okay.
Verse 34, and Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, each one of you bring me his ox or his sheep and slaughter it here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So all the people that night brought each one his ox with him and slaughtered it there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Then Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by nighttime and take spoil among them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. So he proposes a night raid, okay? And they said to him, do whatever seems good to you. So the priest said, let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou give them into the hand of Israel? Notice this, underline this. But he did not answer him on that day. The Lord doesn't give him an answer. He won't answer him. He won't listen to him. Okay? And so Saul said, draw here, all of you chiefs of the people, and investigate and see how this sin has happened. For as the Lord lives and delivers Israel, though it is in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But none of all the people answered him. There's the next silly thing. Okay? Who's the hero of the story? Jonathan. So in his arrogance, what does he say? Even if my son is the one found guilty, I'm going to kill him. Good guy. Right? All right. So let's go through this. Jonathan points out to the army that they would have had increased effectiveness if there hadn't been an oath. That's found in verses 28 and 31. Again, reiterated times 2, the people were very weary. Now, the oath was for that day, for a 24-hour time frame. The army was so weary and famished that they took the animals from the spoil of the Philistines and ate them with blood in them. What does Genesis 9:4 say early on? The life is in the blood, don't eat the blood.
Right.
That's as early as a rule as there was. Okay? Now, of course, we see, of course, that this sin occurred because of silly, impulsive oath. Now, turn to another Old Testament verse to look at it. and that's Leviticus 17. And I want you to look at verse 10.
Leviticus 17.
And any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among us, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and I will cut him off from among the people. It's a serious violation, okay? And yet they were put in a position because they were so famished that they did this because of Saul's oath. It's the consequence of making this stupid oath and making them live under it. Now,
Was he just being mean?
no, he was being arrogant. He just arbitrarily came up with stuff because I'm the king. I'm the king, okay? Now, I want you to know something about this issue of blood. Why does God make such a big deal about not eating the blood?
Because
Well,
there is DNA in this blood.
The blood's used for atonement of sin.
That's true. That's one reason. That's a good reason.
Unique information about something to DNA.
Well, of course, in their time, that wasn't a big deal, but, you know, because they didn't have the ability to do that. But still, notice something. What has Satan built into his rituals? Blood drinking, the sacrifice of the young. The younger, the better, because that's how they believe they attain increased spiritual demonic power, is by consuming the blood. And if you've ever read about occult practices, the real, you know, this is their key thing, is they usually kidnap a child, okay? That's what they do. And they put them on the altar they built. They kill them. They drain the blood out of the child and drink it. That's the deal. So, it's interesting. Historically, Jews used a lot of salt to absorb blood when they prepared the meat. They would, after they drained it as much as they could, then they would either cut it open and pack it with salt for a while, or rub it on and that absorbed even more blood, okay? Now, it's interesting. They couldn't eat it or use it then because it had the blood in it. So what would they do with it? You know what they did?
Hanging on the horns of the altar.
No. You know what they did?
Like somebody dies, there's blood spilled, they'll clean it up, those cloths and stuff, and they will bury that because they consider that
Right.
life.
It's part of the life of the person.
Now run that by me one more time.
Okay. Say it again, Bill.
If, say somebody's killed and blood all over the ground, they'll take cloths and clean all that up, but then they'll bury those cloths because it contains the blood. Because it has the life in it.
Okay.
Now,
That was back when, right?
No,
I think, you watch them clean up blood on the streets of Jerusalem now, they use
they do that today.
Yeah.
They wear special shoes and everything.
notice something else. I'll tell you something else you may not know.
I didn't know that.
The other thing they did with the salt that was used to absorb blood is, since they couldn't eat it or use it, they used it and threw it on the roadways to kill weeds and foliage.
I would agree with that.
That is commonly what they did. Now, you don't have to go here, but I'm going to read something to you. This verse will make a lot more sense because I just told you this. This is Jesus speaking in Matthew 5, okay? Verse 13. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to throw out and be trampled underfoot by men. Now you understand more what he's saying, aren't you? He's talking of that particular practice. All right? Now, this issue with Saul brings up another interesting point, and I think it's an important point. This issue shows that there are limits to obedience to the orders of authority. Notice, rulers, bosses, and managers are to make rules for the best function of the employees or citizens of their country. That's why they're given authority, okay? So they make rules that serve people and their needs. But look at managerial systems all over the place now. They make rules that annoy their employees, that hamstring their employees, that put impossible workloads on their employees. And so we have people quitting jobs all the time because they can't stand the management practice. I mean, it's all over the place, you know? So
Well, yeah.
now, so often we see in today's world that management makes stupid rules. This leads to alienated employees or citizens. Notice something else. Go to Matthew 11. Now, ever try to see a boss who makes stupid rules? Ever try to talk to them about it?
They don't listen.
What happens when you try to talk to them about it typically?
There's-
I mean, there's exceptions of really good, employers, but in general, if you try to point out that, why are we doing it, this rule? Because it's gonna, what do they say?
Take a hike.
Right,
Or it's my idea, so we're gonna continue.
exactly. That's what they're gonna say. There's no discussion. I'm the boss, I have authority, do it. Sound like anyone we're just reading about?
Or they say, what a great idea, and then they fire it.
That's another possibility too.
Yeah,
Okay.
that too.
Now, look at Matthew 11, and we're going to read starting in verse 28. I want to show you what Jesus' view of authority is. All right? 28. Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, burdened, okay? And I will give you rest or release. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. So what do? Jesus says, I'm the leader of the church, okay? Watch how I behave, watch how I act, and then follow it. But he doesn't do things for himself. He does things for others. And then finally, verse 30, for my yoke is easy and my load is light. That's God's kingdom. That's the leadership of Jesus Christ in the church. But look at organizations, especially church organizations, and look how they're run. They get a board of elders or directors or whatever. What do they start to do typically?
Fuss.
They make a lot of rules,
Yeah,
and they say, it's our way or the highway.
we're the elders, we're the leaders. This is what we've decided. This is God's will. And anyone tries to talk to him about it. Does anyone successfully talk to someone like that and had them come back and say, oh, I'm sorry, you're right about that. I think let's reconsider.
No.
It hardly ever happens. I mean, it does occasionally because sometimes you have an actually good owner or good manager of a company and they will act in the way in which we're talking about, of trying to do the best for employees, trying to make them successful, trying to make their job easier so they can be more productive, but there are not that many of them,
That's right.
okay?
That's right. Mostly greed, self-oriented.
Now, I always enjoy it when management makes an agreement with someone about compensation, like you'll make so many percent if you sell so many things, and then inevitably, it's just a matter of time before they come back to you, and what do they say?
You
have to sell more.
We changed the rule now, and you know that 5% we said we were going to, well, we decided that's not really right, so it's going to go to 2%. But that's okay, you can make it up, you just have to see way more and sell way more. Who are they concerned about? Themselves. Think of the big corporations.
Rather not.
Who makes the money in those corporations?
The board of directors and the senior Chief Executive Officer.
Exactly. They make, usually in a big corporation, millions. They give themselves often $1 million bonuses. Notice, they give themselves $1 million bonuses.
Perfect example of that is State Auto Insurance was just purchased by Liberty Mutual. It was $24.85 per share. The board of directors, because I used to sit on it,
Uh-huh.
gave themselves thousands of shares of stock. At closing on this past week, it was $53.25. So the millions were paid in the purchase by Liberty to the board of directors.
To the board of
CEO,
directors.
Plus bonuses.
Right.
So is that a good example for you?
Exactly.
And it just happened.
The top down.
Yeah.
The top rakes it in, and everyone below them, who's actually doing the majority of the work for the company,
Right.
who's actually running the company,
Right.
it's like, the next thing you hear is, we're a little tight this year. We're just not gonna be able to give anyone raises.
Mhm.
They just raked in bonuses they gave themselves, but they can't give raises to anyone else.
Mhm.
That's the mentality of the poor manager, the poor owner, the poor corporation. It happens, Norm,
Yep.
all the time.
Can I take it one step further?
Go ahead, give it one
Our
step.
government.
We're gonna get there.
He's getting the-
We're gonna get there. Yeah, it is, exactly. Now, in verses 32 through 34, if you go back to our text in 1 Samuel 14, he says, the people rushed greedily upon the spoil. They took sheep and oxen and calves, this is the Philistines' animals, and slew them on the ground and ate them the blood. And Saul said, behold, the people are sinning
Yes.
against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? Now, the people tell Saul that someone's eating the animals with the blood in it. So the next impulsive act is that Saul sets up a great stone altar to sacrifice and drain the blood. Who's supposed to do sacrifices of animals in Israel? The priests, not the king. So once again, he makes another stupid mistake and violates another principle of the
Thank you,
Lord.
sweetie. Appreciate it.
Now, here's one thing. Now, let me, Mikey was going to talk about government, and I'll talk about it a little bit more as we
Thanks.
go on. But think about this. This country was set up by some very, very wise men who they were intelligent and they did a lot of thinking about how to set up a republic.
Right.
And they built it into basically 3 units. Obviously, the executive branch,
Mhm.
the judicial branch,
Mhm.
and of course, the representatives. Okay, that so supposedly are to make the laws.
Mhm.
Who's supposed to make the laws?
Legislature.
The House, the legislature, House and the Senate. Okay, the president's not supposed to make laws. And the court is not supposed to make laws. They're supposed to evaluate laws.
Right.
Okay, now, we have developed this very interesting, and I believe absolutely illegal principle. It's called executive orders.
Yes.
And these orders are running this country.
Mhm.
And the branch, the administrative branch, the president just makes them up and signs this document. It never went through Congress.
Mhm.
I think that is absolutely completely illegal.
Well,
How
they
does that
allow it
happen?
under an emergency situation.
But-
And that's what every one of them do. I don't care who the president is.
Well, it's very
They
easy.
declare it an emergency.
Right.
Yeah.
Then they're allowed to have executive privilege.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting, though? They declare an emergency. So
They
they
did.
decide
Mhm.
that anything they want to be an emergency becomes an emergency.
Yeah.
Well, if you think back in the 1700s, what were they faced with? When they formed the government, they were faced with a war.
Yep.
With whom?
England.
King George III.
Right.
Mhm.
So they wrote that in there to allow, as time went on, executive privilege. They gave George Washington the right to make decisions.
Mhm.
And who didn't want to run again? George Washington.
Because he never wanted to become a king,
Right,
because that's what he just got rid of.
right,
That's right.
right.
And that's what happens when the executive overreaches, they literally become the king.
Exactly.
And that's the problem we have today. We got a lot more, but that's one of them,
Yeah.
okay? Now, notice, let's go back to verse 36. Then Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night, take the spoil from them. And by the morning light, let us not leave a man of them. And they say, do whatever seems best.
To you.
Okay, to you. Okay. Now, then 37. Now here's an innovative idea. And Saul inquired of the Lord. Wow. Does this guy not have it backwards?
Absolutely.
He moves, he does, he decides, and then later, if it doesn't go so well, then he inquires from the Lord. And of course, this is why, another reason why we read in the text, but the Lord didn't answer him. And he asked, shall I go down after the Philistines and do this? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But the Lord did not answer him on that day. Now that should give you a clue. If you ask and he's not answering you, you've screwed up.
Somewhere along.
Okay? But Saul never thinks he screwed up. You'll see it as we go on. So, he assumes, therefore, Saul, that someone broke his oath, and he wants the priest to figure it out. Verse 38, and Saul said, draw near, all you chiefs of the people, and investigate and see how this sin happened. And what they do is that they investigate, and he, as we're going to read a few more verses, he then calls the priests to cast lots. All right? Now, let's read 40 through 46. He then said to all Israel, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan, my son, will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, give a perfect lot. What's he asking God to do? By using a lot system, we don't know exactly what it is, okay? But it's been used before, and I'll show you. He's saying, through the lot, give us the answer. And so and Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. In other words, the lot fell on the two of them and not on his commanders and people in the army. So now it's been isolated to two people as to what's wrong. You see? All right. Verse 42, and Saul said, cast lots between me and Jonathan, my son. And Jonathan was taken. Now, what does Saul assume because Jonathan's taken?
It's his fault.
Yes,
Mhm,
that's what he assumes.
mhm.
But you're going to see very quickly, that's not what happens. Who's really taken is Saul. All right. So, and verse 43 is interesting. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. So Jonathan told him and said, I indeed tasted a little honey with the end of my staff that was in my hand. Now, the last sentence is a pretty atrocious translation from the Hebrew. In mine, it says, here I am, I must die. What's yours say?
Same thing.
Okay,
Will die.
okay. Now, in the Hebrew, it says, am I now to die? In other words, since God used me to create this victory,
Mhm.
and because it was my faith that was put in action that caused us to be able to win this battle,
Mhm.
and because I didn't take your oath, because I didn't know about your oath, really? I'm supposed to die now? That's really in the Hebrew what it indicates.
Okay.
Now, verse 44, and Saul said, may God do this to me and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. So he makes his next rash vow. Because that's a vow. And basically, what he says is, in essence, if you don't die, then I'm going to die. And of course, they will. And Saul is one more step closer to the end of his kingship by what he's doing here. Now, notice the next thing in verse 45. This is a very interesting verse to me. But the people, now who's the people? The army. Okay, okay. But the people said to Saul, "Must Jonathan die, who has brought about the great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head to fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Now, think about this. They just took it upon themselves to defy and disobey their king and their military commander. That's what they did. All right. Now, now what happens, of course, is that Saul then retreats from there because he's humiliated, and this night raid that he proposed doesn't occur. All right. Now, it brings up an interesting question, I think, that I think it's very important. And that is, when some people read Romans chapter 13, they interpret those verses to indicate the government is supreme and you always do what the king or the leader says. That's how they interpret those verses. That is an absolutely awful interpretation of those verses. Okay, because we see repeated instances all the way through the Bible of people that do not obey an authority and are commended for not doing it. Here's another example of it right here. Okay, the military generals and his staff say, no, we're not going to do it. They defy him. They disobey his orders. And it brings up an interesting question. I'm going to go into a little bit more in a minute. That is there a place to disobey authorities' orders?
Always.
Now, why did they disobey him? They disobeyed him because they saw nothing that Jonathan did to violate any of the Torah laws that would ever cause him to be put to death. And they saw the good things he did. And so they evaluated it and said, no way, you're king, but we're not doing this. Okay, so they grab him and he escapes from the situation. So it makes you think about when authorities make rules that are odious on people and are not for the benefit of people, that take away the authority and the liberty and the money of people, that bind people into silly rules. We just saw a whole bunch of them from the CDC for the last 2 years. Okay. The question is then, is there a place to disobey? And I think the text and other places indicate, yes, there is. It's not to be done carelessly. It's not to be done impulsively, but your back can be put to the wall as a Christian where someone's telling you to do something that is not right. And you shouldn't do things that the Bible says you shouldn't do.
Amen.
If the Lord says don't do it, I don't care who that guy says. I'm not doing it because I'm following my Lord. And that's what we should be doing. That's why I say that the typical Romans 13 explanation that I've read over and over, I think is absolute madness. Now, so, then what we see, well, let's go on to, of course, Saul's humiliated, and let's go to verses 47 to 52 and close this chapter. It says, when Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, the sons of Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobdah, the Philistines, and wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment. and he acted valiantly and defeated the Amalekites and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. Now, that's going to be interesting because that's next week's topic. Okay? Next week is about his battle with the Amalekites, where he does another stupid thing that again gets him in further trouble. Okay? So we'll study that. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan and Ishvi and Malchi-Shua, and the names of his two daughters, the name of his firstborn daughter was Merab, and the name of the younger was Michal, and the name of Saul's wife was Anam,
Whatever.
Anam, and the daughter Ahimaaz, and the name of the captain of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Verse 51, and Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner the father of Abner, who was the son of Abiel. Now the war was against the Philistines was severe all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw the mighty men, of any valiant men, he attached him to his staff. Now let me go through this and explain some of these things, why these details were being given. What we see is that he is commended here for being a pretty good military commander. As a lousy king, okay? And he has character flaws out the wazoo, but he apparently is pretty good in battle. And that's what it's telling us here in these verses. His failure was that he didn't follow the law, and that was his downfall. Now,
He was not really close to God.
no, he wasn't. We never see anywhere that Saul went to the Lord and prayed.
Except
Okay, well, he went to the priest to ask for the lot to be cast, but he never actually, seemed to.
what do I do now, Lord?
Exactly. Now, the thing that's amazing to me is that despite his flaws, okay, and everything, he had so many problems with disobedience. And it amazes to me when you read commentators, okay, on these verses in 1 Samuel, time and time again, they'll say that Saul is a Christ-like figure. I think they're out of their minds.
Well, where does that come from?
They think,
Where are you hearing that at?
commentary after commentary. You read a particular commenter who's been studying the section, and they'll say frequently, Saul's a Christ-like figure. He's a typology of Messiah. Well, if he's a typology of Messiah, we're in trouble.
Really trouble.
When you get a chance, give me that information.
Okay.
I haven't read that before.
Okay.
I
I
find that
heard
interesting.
that too.
Okay, now, Saul's sons are listed 5 times in the Old Testament, but only Jonathan and Ishbosheth, his other son, have future stories and are connected to the biblical narrative. The other 3 we don't really hear of. Now, of course, his 2 daughters, the youngest, is going to be the future wife of King David. Now, his top general, this is why when you go into these, when he's saying Kish was the father of Saul and Ner the father of Abner and the son, okay, that can get confusing, but let me make it very simple for you, okay? His top general is Abner, okay? Abner is the son of a man named Ner. Ner is the brother, okay, of Kish, Saul's father. All right, so Abner is the son of Ner, and Ner is the grandfather of Saul, and Abner is Saul's uncle. That's what it's saying. So his chief commander, he appoints someone in his family, Abner, to be the chief commander of, and Abner, of course, ends up, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, outliving Saul and moving into the time of David. Pretty certain that Abner was there. That brings up a whole nother interesting story, but now A compromised leader eventually leads to a compromised nation. When more sin is tolerated, then consequences build up for the nation. Also, the more we neglect Scripture and don't teach and follow what the New Testament and Old Testament say, follow God's word, then, of course, the word ends up being disrespected. They start to cut out things they don't like and just do the things that they do like. So in other words, this is where you get, I'm a solid Christian. I'm living with my girlfriend and we're going to get married. Okay. All right. Now, we see an increased emphasis today in our culture of having fun and wanting to have a lot of money. That seems to be the moral code of what the young people, especially in this culture, adhere to. So it leads, of course, to spiritual immaturity in the believer. And this is what we see all over the place, is terrible spiritual immaturity. Now, when this happens, the nation rots from the inside out, okay? And eventually collapses on itself. Notice, if you look back in our history of the last 50 or 60 years, and of course, a lot of us can remember, the 1950s, I think it was 75% of people attended a church at least 2 times a month. I mean, when we were young, on Sunday, you went to church,
Yeah.
okay?
If you didn't, everybody went.
Right?
Well, you had something else that motivated them. It's called blue laws.
That's true.
Nothing else to do.
That's true, right. The blue laws were, the businesses were not to be open on Sunday, so Sunday was supposed to be a time that honored the commandment,
Amen.
right? The Sabbath
Right.
commandment. We don't see anyone honoring, practically, anyone honoring the Sabbath commandment anymore.
There are a few stores.
Okay, now, I want to quote from James Madison, one of the founding fathers of our country. He says, the Constitution requires sufficient virtue among the people for self-government to occur. If not, nothing less than chains of despotism, that is authoritarian government, can restrain men from destroying and devouring one another.
So
That's his
true.
quote. Okay, in other words, to have a constitutional republic, you have to have reasonable morality. If you don't have reasonable morality, you eventually will not have a republic. And you look at so many of our leaders today, and they are horrid.
Well, if you think back when he was writing that, there's an oxymoron.
Okay,
Slaves. Big time.
yeah,
Everyone from the southern colonies up disavowed what you just read because of slaves.
well, to an extent that's true, and I think that's, admittedly, the founding fathers were not perfect men, okay? They weren't, but they were men of great vision.
Yeah.
And the Constitution was meant to protect the Republic and to show us as members of the Republic how to run the Republic. Now, notice what we're seeing today. I just read, it was a Supreme Court ruling. It was recent, the last couple months. I think it was on EPA water right issues that was issued by the Trump administration. I think that's what it was about. At any rate, the Supreme Court ruled and said the Trump administration was right in this, and therefore the rule still stands. You know what I read multiple times in the media? They told the Biden administration to simply disregard the court ruling. So that's where we are.
Yeah.
Just do anything you want, because what you want is more important than a 200 and some year old constitution was set up very carefully to protect you. That's unbelievable. Unbelievable, but that's what happened. Now, let me read another quote and then we'll finish. Professor Robbie George, who's a professor at Princeton, said the following: people lacking virtue can be counted on to trade liberty for personal protection, personal security, and comfort. What do we see today?
Absolutely.
Exactly that.
Okay. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about this. You can turn here if you want to, but I was going to turn to 1 Thessalonians. You know, this is very prophetic. I'm going to go to 1 Thessalonians 5. And this also is talking about something that's very prophetic, because he's talking in verse 1, now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need to be written, I think more to be written you know full well that the day of the Lord will come. So he's talking about prophetic events. And look what he says in verse 3. While they are saying peace and safety, upon them suddenly like birth pangs upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So in other words, if you want peace and safety, you're going to be giving up eventually your rights for the government to protect you. I don't know about you, but I really don't care about the government protecting me. I just wish the government would keep their hands off of me so I could live the way I believe I should as a Christian.
Right.
But the government is always interfering in one way or another. Okay? You know, no one can even keep up with the number of laws and codes of law and administrative law that's produced every day by the government.
That's why they, in the Constitution and otherwise, they mandated there's only certain times the House and the Senate can meet, for the very reason that you just implicated. Because the more they meet, what do you get? The more garbage comes out.
Absolutely.
Somebody gets an idea that we need a law
And
or a rule.
they
That's your
also
problem.
were not professional politicians. They would come, I forget what was it, early spring they would come? And I think they would meet
It's
until
still the same, it
Yeah.
hasn't changed.
okay.
It's still the same.
But
The
they,
Constitution
but
hasn't
like
changed.
Norm's saying, the intention was they were business owners and all this, and they came for a relatively short period of time to Washington to meet, to deal with the issues of law and interpretation of law and interpretation of the Constitution. But then they went back and lived their life. They weren't paid to do this.
Davy Crockett, seriously, he did attend Congress. How long was he there? 2 years.
Really.
He didn't want to stay.
Wise man. Wise man. Now, lastly, I'm going to quote one of my favorite theologians, and that's Dr. Francis Schaeffer. Okay, now Pam knows Schaeffer. I don't know if anyone else has read stuff. Bill, have you read Schaeffer stuff?
Not much.
Yeah. Schaeffer wrote something like 27 books, and they're absolutely brilliant. I would say, my opinion, that Schaeffer was the best, probably one of the absolute best theologians of the 20th century. He was an unbelievably insightful man. Look what he said in the 1970s. Here's his quote, okay? The moral code of America has devolved into personal peace and affluence. Leave me alone and don't tell me what I can do. Don't judge me. I have the right to do whatever, and I want to have money so I can do the fun I want. And Schaeffer saw that in the 70s, that's what this culture was devolving into.
Yeah, but what do we have then? Vietnam, drugs, sex, all kinds of things going on in our generation.
Right, exactly, and that's the point. The 50s were relatively morally clean times, okay? The early 60s were, but once you start to get into the middle 60s, boom. Prayer is taken out of school. God is considered that she should never be involved in anything that has to do with government or a school system.
I
All right.
heard you use she.
You have the liberalization in 1973 of divorce law, no-fault divorce, okay? You have obviously Wade versus Roe in 1973. You keep going on and you see that we kept doing these things that were just undermining our republic. undermining. And therefore, it's not too hard to conclude, I think, that eventually there's going to be a collapse.
Yes.
Because we have accumulated so much judgment against us because of things we've allowed, that I think that's what's gonna happen.
I think
I do
God's
too.
gonna one day say, hey, that's enough.
Yeah, it's almost like in Genesis where he said that Abraham would move in and take over the land when the iniquity of the Amorite was full. In other words, it's almost like a cup, and the bad immoral things are dripping into it. This would be the Amorite cup, the people of Canaan, okay? And God said, when it spills over, bye-bye. And I think we're in the same position, my opinion. So, anyway, let's stop because we have something fun we're going to do. We're going to have communion. So let me pray briefly, and then we'll be done here. Okay. So, Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to learn your word. Thank you for how it applies to our lives and for its wisdom. We thank you for all these things in Christ's name. Amen.